Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for your kind introduction, Jeremy. It's a great pleasure to give this keynote speech, particularly at this pivotal time for 3D. And I'd like to, in front of you, extend my thanks to Ravensbourne for hosting the event, which really brings into sharp focus a lot of the issues surrounding where 3D is going at the moment. The title of the conference, 3D Storytelling, neatly summarizes most of those issues. How can we take 3D from where it is today, making it more than the gimmick that it has been seen in the past, and actually use it as a genuine, creative storytelling tool? I'm not here to talk about the technical, the interaxials, the convergences, the equipment, editing, how to deal with 3D in those contexts. There are a lot of people here, a lot of sessions doing exactly that. The likes of Adam Sculthorpe talking about 3D broadcast. He's done and been responsible for establishing the Sky 3D sports broadcast that many of you will have seen. The likes of Phil Strather, with his wonderful Meerkats, a project that he'll be talking about later. Phil's also tying a lot of the strands together at the end of the evening. Jeremy mentioned how a lot of true creativity comes out of discourse, disagreement, different ideas bumping together, and I think that's a key thing for this, and I think Phil will look to try and pull a lot of those different ideas together. Phil's been involved in 3D as much as almost anybody in this room and at this event, and has a wealth of experience that can bring to bear on that. There are other speakers talking about specific projects. Mark Samuelson on TT3D, Richard Lloyd talking about Creeping Zero, Tim Keen's here talking about VFX, and we've got production and scripting advice, and a lot more discussions on 3D. And I would encourage you to embrace the differences of opinion and actively seek those out. It's out of those differences. That's where 3D is in flux, and it'll be out of those differences that I think a lot of the most interesting work and changes and differences will come forward. My intention here today is not to give the answers. I don't have all the answers. It'll be up to everybody here to develop those and come up with those. And for my reason for being here, what I want to get across from this talk is an idea of where 3D can go. How can it be used? How can it be approached? What should we be looking at doing with it? And what lessons can we learn from the past? I want to look at where we are today and how we arrived here from the past, some of the lessons that we can learn from even the Renaissance or Victorian times. Look at the state of 3D today and what's being done and the reasons for that and how we can move forward from that and where we should be taking it. And to try and bring it back to something a bit more tangible, I want to end by going through 2 or 3 examples of projects that we've worked on over the last 6 months, looking at some of the decisions that were made in that. Some of these we'd probably do differently now. Some of these no doubt can be improved on, but it'll start to give an idea of where I consider that development can come and how we've looked to work together in the present and how that can be evolved into the future. As I mentioned, the attempt to convey depth in an otherwise flat medium has been around since the Renaissance. The early attempts at perspective frames, Leonardo da Vinci's attempt at conveying depth through atmosphere with his atmosphere frames and apparatus. A lot of these early 2D cues, which kids in school now understand and learn in art class, but which at those times were very new. Those 2D depth cues we've been using in 2D film for the last century to add a feeling of depth, and these are just as important in 3D now. Any of you who've worked in 3D will know how using some of those 2D depth cues will add an extra level of depth and extra satisfaction to the 3D image, things like motion parallax, perspective, even focus, which in the past some purists have said everything in a 3D frame should be in focus. That can be used intelligently and creatively to add to the depth that you get from the stereo. It wasn't until Victorian times, initially with drawings and later with photographs, that stereographs first appeared. They were popularized when the Queen was given one at the Great Exhibition in 1851, and for the next 50, 60, 70 years, 3D photography was as commonplace as 2D. 2D photography, anyway, was complex and difficult, and the added cumbersomeness of 3D made very little difference. And a lot of the historical photographs that you'll have seen of the time, shots of Queen Victoria or Isambard Kingdom Brunel standing in front of the anchor chain of the Great Eastern, a lot of those old historical photographs were actually taken in 3D. We're only aware of them from 2D because of the limitations of print medium. But the Victorians were very aware of how, in a time before film, cinema, 3D was able to convey much more information than 2D was. It could tell more of the story, and the Victorians used it to good effect. 3D film, the first incarnation of that in large-scale commercial form occurred in the early 50s. It had made its first appearances in the 1930s, and well, 3D film itself appeared in the early 20s, but the first polarized films at the New York Fair in the late 30s. The renewed interest in that came in the 50s with films such as Boy and the Devil. But a lot of these early attempts at 3D were so poor that by the time a director came along who actually had an idea of how to use this intelligently, creatively, the medium had more or less killed itself off. And it wasn't until 1982, 2 years after Hitchcock's death, that there was the first wide-scale release of Dial M for Murder. Hitchcock realized that, either by chance or good judgment, he anyway used long shots and gave the audience the chance to look around the scene. But he realized in 3D this happened even more. Audiences would look around the scene wherever they were directed to look. It's one of the biggest learning curves for directors with 3D. A lot of the old tricks that they use to focus people's attention no longer have the same strength. Even focus, audiences will look at soft focus areas in 3D because they want to make sense of it, and it's, even if it's behind the main subject they're looking at, it is a separate object. Hitchcock realized this, and he gave his audiences time to look around the scene and time to come back to what would have been the primary focus in 2D and where he wanted them to look all along. But unfortunately, the medium never benefited from his insight and how he may have used it going forward from Dial M for Murder. It's still considered one of the most interesting and worthwhile 3D films that's been produced. Most people consider these early 3D films, the early incarnations of 3D in the 50s and the 80s, as the precursor to where we are today. And while it can be considered as the first attempts for mainstream 3D cinema, I think a much more accurate starting point is IMAX and IMAX 3D. IMAX, right from the start, set out to have a quality threshold that set it apart from other forms of filmmaking. It originally found favor, particularly with the institutional market. It found itself in educational institutions, science institutions, places like the Washington Air and Space Museum, the Smithsonian in the States. And the remit of a lot of these places centered around education. So that helped lift off the documentary side of IMAX. IMAX was well known, still is well known for its documentary filmmaking. And in 3D as well, this is a film form that really benefits from the 3D. We've used it to good effect in 3D IMAX work that we've done. It helps explain subject matter much better than 2D can. We've used it with sequences on life before birth, chick embryos developing inside the egg, looking through semi-transparent membranes of the outer egg through to the embryo behind, the heart inside the transparent embryo beating inside the chest cavity, and the red blood cells pumping along the blood vessels from there. In 3D, that all makes sense. You can see the space, you can feel the spherical nature of it, you can see the life pumping through. In 2D, a lot of that gets lost. The membrane that you're looking through merges with the embryo behind. The heart is no longer beating within a chest cavity, it's just part of what makes up the embryo, and the red blood cells become the texture that defines the blood vessels rather than what is pumping through them. IMAX and cinema have been converging for a while now. IMAX introduced the DMR process, which was a way whereby standard theatrical release feature films could be shown and repurposed for the larger screen. And that, combined with its attention to detail and the inarguable quality of the format in terms of conveying information, has led to a lot of directors looking at it as a format for their film. Even some of the mainstream Hollywood features, like The Dark Knight, shot sequences with IMAX film cameras, and some of them going forward are looking at shooting the whole film with the cumbersome but beautiful IMAX film cameras. This brings us to where we are today with 3D. The 3D benchmark for a lot of people and the focus for a lot of 3D over the past 5 years has been Avatar. There was a lot of critical appraisal of what Avatar was going to give us in terms of 3D leading up to it. A lot of the critics questioned whether a genuine feature film, something that you would expect to see at the cinema, something of 2 or 3 hours length, could actually work in the 3D format. And a lot of Jim Cameron's aims with Avatar were to ensure that the 3D didn't detract from what he was trying to say. It answered the critics. It was definitely a very watchable film in 3D, and it was a very solid benchmark. A lot of the films that have come since then have drawn from that, but created a very formulaic way of showing 3D. They keep the majority of the action behind the screen. They keep the parallax down well below 1%. Parallax is a measure of the amount of depth in a scene. And a lot of the films coming out now and over the last year or so have played it very safe. Actually, these can work, and actually they can make the 3D medium compromise the 2D. Keeping everything behind the cinema screen can actually draw your attention to the screen. If it's this wall that the information cannot cross, your eye actually gets drawn to that and becomes conscious of it. So playing it safe, while it may not detract from the story, it certainly doesn't add from the story. And I think that's what we're really looking at over this conference, is how we can use 3D to genuinely add to the 2D so that you get more benefit by seeing it in 3D. And it's the first choice rather than the second choice for a quality experience from the medium.